I think perhaps the only thing it may have told us that we should have been prepared for was that, like everything else that the Chinese do, they they get to do it a whole lot quicker than we forecast they would.
Well, that all sets the scene for what Australia needs to be thinking about in this, as you say, rapidly changing and evolving world and geostrategic environment. So if we can come back to Australia and its national security and defence strategies, clearly the Americans are saying to us that they want us to spend more on defence, and they're putting a figure as a percentage of GDP. Perhaps it might be useful here just for you to recapitulate why you think that's a bad way of thinking about what Australia needs to do in the defence space.
Well, GDP, of course, as you know, is subject to change, and it's not the basis on which the government raises the revenue that it needs to spend on defence. There's an economic connection that you're far better equipped to explain than me, but it lies at the end of a process. We don't start with oh, well, we'll spend 2% of GDP on defence and then work from there to a plan on how to spend that. We design a plan for spending the revenue that the government thinks it can commit to defence, and that comes out as a number. And then we go, well, what does that look like compared with GDP? That's a rational way of making a budget. I mean, anyone I think who starts with the answer in mind without looking at its earning capacity in simple terms is going to end up with strife sooner or later. What I think any rational approach would look like is to start with what we think we need, why we think we need it, justifying that, and then figuring out how much we think that's going to cost. And as much as I might, really want to have a Ferrari, I'm going to have to make do with something a whole lot less than that because my ability to raise the revenue necessary to own and operate and maintain a Ferrari doesn't exist. So that goes back to my sort of suggestion in the first instance that where we probably should start. And now is the perfect time, if not the essential time, to start doing this is to, and I say that because of the changing landscape strategically in the world and our region especially, one of the most profoundly affected regions in the future. Start with what do we think under these circumstances, the risks to our national security, what is our strategy for protecting our national security, and what, as a subset of that, is a defence strategy that makes sense, and then what do we think we're going to buy? Now, I mean, I think in all of that, there is a fairly sound logic that says for a very long time, we have not invested enough in our defence organisation to really do justice to the emerging strategic circumstances that we now face, which are not, I mean, they haven't just crept up on us.
Indeed.
This has been coming for a very long time. And so I think there is a case that can be made for the need to be spending more on defence. And you can't come up with a simple answer without doing a lot of analysis and thought. You also can't come up with and what are the implications of that? If we do that, what are we now not going to be doing? Or are we going to take some more substantial steps like perhaps examining the fundamentals of our taxation system, which is something that I think is long overdue, and I'd welcome your views on that. But then equally, the notion that if you take into account the almost continual criticism of the Defence Organisation for its spending on projects and capability acquisition, that sort of stuff, logically and sensibly you would suggest that before anyone starts throwing more money at defence as it is, we need to try to do something about helping it to get more able to credibly, efficiently and successfully spend the money that it's provided with, whilst also getting perhaps better value for money. I would say certainly better value for money, especially when it comes to the Navy. These things, I don't say all of those things to make it sound more complex than it needs to be. I don't think it's actually complex. It's just not something that we're necessarily used to doing in totality and demonstrably doing well.
Right. So possibly the risk of oversimplifying, but partly influenced by what I've read of Hugh White's essay and what you're saying here. There are two different types of pressures for Australia to spend more and to spend more effectively on defence. One might be if we want to assume justifiably that the Americans are an important, vital strategic ally for us. They're saying they expect us to do more heavy lifting. But if alternatively, as Hugh White is suggesting, and he's not the only one, that in fact, because of the changes that are going on in the United States that are profound and will probably continue beyond the end of the current administration in the United States, we need to spend more on our own because we can't depend on the United States as a reliable ally. Are the answers to the questions different depending on which of those two propositions turns out to be correct?
Yes, I think they are, and I think if we look at how we are today, you would say that's the sort of outcome that you get when you place a high level of reliance on great and powerful friend to be there when we need them. You end up where we are today. If, however, as Hugh suggests, we would be wise not to place such a heavy reliance on that, noting, of course, that we are not blessed in the ANZUS Treaty with what they call an Article 5 of the suggestion of living underneath the nuclear deterrent umbrella of the United States. We don't have that article in our treaty, unlike NATO, unlike Japan. And then you add to it the behaviours that we're seeing, which seem to suggest, and so much, as Hugh rightly says, I think, and I've said too, so much of this is not necessarily all about Trump. It's about a lot more than that, which of course is one of the principal reasons why the United States that we knew is not going to be back, because it's not, relatively speaking, in the same position that it used to be, and it cannot be again, most likely. So its national interests have changed. This is the whole point of an alliance. Alliances survive while both parties have national interests served by being in the alliance. Now, I'm not suggesting that we get rid of the alliance, not for a second. I think there's a huge amount of value in it still for us that we need to think a little more clearly about. But placing the reliance that we have in the past, doesn't seem to me to make any sense anymore. So that we are in a different situation that needs for us to think differently. Hugh points out, and I think he's probably right, that I think his words were, in a sad way, President Trump has probably done us a favour by bursting our bubble to an extent. But this is what, for me, I think is no more nor less than a time that should have come to us a long time ago of thinking a little more independently for ourselves. We're not living on the doorstep of Europe. We're not living on the doorstep of the United States, protected by two big, beautiful oceans on either side, as Canada. We're not living in a tiny but splendid isolation of a New Zealand. We are living as an Anglo origin country. We're living in our own specific, unique geostrategic and geopolitical circumstances. And we need to think for ourselves, about ourselves, and what that means for our national security, I think a lot harder than we have been showing a willingness to do to this point.
Well, I completely agree with that. And in particular, my interpretation of the election result in the US is not so much that Trump won it, but that the American people voted for him with far greater knowledge of who and what he is and what he will do than they had in either 2016 or 2020. That tells us some profound things about how the American people have changed from the American people who saved the world from fascism 80 years ago and who over the following 45 years stared down the threat of Soviet communism, two of the biggest evils that the world has known in human history, that they are a very different people and they have very different interests from what they did then. But just before we leave that, if we can for a moment more pursue the assumption that Australia can rely on the US as a major strategic partner, which seems to be a bipartisan assumption by both of our major political parties for the moment.
Yeah.
We have put, it would seem, most of our eggs in the AUKUS budget, and that in particular is about the eventual acquisition, so we've been promised, of initially American and subsequently British designed, possibly Australian made nuclear submarines. And then all of a sudden, just before we're recording this conversation, we learn that the United States is going to have a review of whether the AUKUS agreement is consistent with the America First positioning of the Trump regime. What do you read into that? Is that serious questioning of whether, in fact, the US remains committed to AUKUS? Or is it just something that is going to be fairly peremptory and it'll be business as usual after that?